So welcome everyone to today's IEN webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. And we're excited to be talking today about how to build a just transition by investing in renewable energy infrastructure and in a way that supports both people and planet. So my name is Hannah Bowen, and I'm a network manager here at the Intentional Endowments Network. And I'm so happy to be moderating this session with two of our IEN members who are going to share some really exciting work and answer your questions about how to put your capital to work in this way. So I'll introduce our panelists and run through a few logistics for the webinar, and then we will dig in. So we'll be hearing today from Dan Chu, the Executive Director of the Sierra Club Foundation, and from two members of Greenbacker Capital, Charles Wheeler, a co-founder and Chief Investment Officer, and Brandon Praznik, Vice President. And after our panelists' initial presentations, we'll spend the remainder of the hour in dialogue responding to your questions. So thanks to those who sent questions in advance, and please feel free to enter questions throughout the presentation in the chat function of the control panel, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can at the end of the session. And we heard from many of you while you were registering that you're looking to, hear about some concrete opportunities that exist in this area. You're looking for arguments that you can use within your institution to make the case for projects that have both social and environmental goals. And a lot of people are just looking for a deeper understanding of this asset class and of what a just transition looks like in practice. So we will be covering all of that in this session. So logistics, this webinar is being recorded. It will be distributed to all registrants by email and will also be available on the IEN website tomorrow. So you can refer back to this conversation and you can share it with others who might be interested. So just briefly before we dive into the discussion, for anyone who's new to IEN, we're a nonprofit collaborative peer learning network where endowments and experts come together to advance the field of aligning investments with institutional mission and with sustainability and performance goals. So we do this in a variety of ways, as you can see up on the screen, including hosting in-person forums. We have several coming up, and you may have seen the announcements about our next large summit in Atlanta next February. We facilitate peer networking, curate resources, and provide educational venues like this webinar. So one of the resources that the network has developed over the last year or so is the Intentionally Designed Endowment Roadmap, which is just a way of organizing how we think about this process of learning and adapting strategies to more closely align your investments with your mission and goals. And this graphic lays out those steps, and behind each of those we have resources. If you go to the web version of this roadmap, you can dig in on each one of those and see examples and resources. And it's also a great point to start today's webinar because we're going to first hear from Dan about the Sierra Club Foundation's journey on this path and how they're thinking about aligning their investments. Then we'll go into kind of an overview of the clean energy infrastructure space and what alignment looks like there, and then back to the Sierra Club Foundation for some specific examples before we turn to questions. So with that, I will hand it over to Dan to kick us off.
Great. Welcome, everybody. My name is Dan Chu. I'm the Executive Director for the Sierra Club Foundation, based here in Oakland, California. And the Sierra Club Foundation is the 501c3 fiscal sponsor for all the charitable work that the Sierra Club undertakes. The Sierra Club is a 501c4 membership organization. And so as part of that role that we play, we manage all of the C3 funds under a couple of different portfolios. And those C3 funds are either money that comes in from outside foundations and donors. It can also be bequests. And then we also have what's called a charitable gift annuity program where people can basically set up a annuity with us as a charitable gift, and then they receive a monthly income until at such time that they pass, and then the principal remains with us. So the reason I mention that is just that our portfolios have some slightly different policy requirements around risk, timeline for investments, expected returns, those kinds of things as well. If you go to the next slide, Hannah. So over the last 8 or 10 years, the Sierra Club Foundation has been on a journey evolving its funds initially from a negative screening or SRI approach to align with ESG portfolio, environmental, social, and governance aspects. And the $100 million of our overall portfolio of $150 million that's invested in equities and bonds are now completely ESG aligned. The third piece is that we do have a small advocacy fund of, I guess you'd call them dirty stocks in oil and gas companies, banks, that kind of thing, so we can be an active shareholder and engage in shareholder advocacy work. We're increasingly, in addition to being ESG aligned, investing in climate solutions and becoming much more mission aligned. In fact, one of the funds that we invest in is Greenbacker, which you'll hear about shortly. And then just recently in the past year, we passed a policy around high impact investing. And I know for a number of folks out there who are family foundations or other types of endowments, think of that as PRI grants and loans. And we've done an initial carve out of a portion of our portfolio to really focus on climate solutions that also advance social justice outcomes. And I'll talk about that shortly after you get an overview from Greenbacker about their strategy. So I'll turn it over to the Greenbacker folks.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And thanks everybody for taking some time out today. Really happy to be part of this discussion with the Intentional Endowment Network and specifically with Dan and the Sierra Club. My name is Brandon Praznik with Greenbacker. I'm also joined by Charles Wheeler, our co-founder and chief investment officer. Hannah, if you just want to go to the next slide, please. This is just to give some background and overview about our business before we'll talk a bit more high level about the renewable energy and sustainable infrastructure asset class, which has certainly grown tremendously in recent years and is on a similar growth path for the years to come. And we'll talk about various strategies, the risks and returns that come along with those strategies, and how you can access this asset class. Greenbacker was formed in 2011, primarily a partnership between Charles, David, and Robert Schur. Charles comes from a 20-plus year background with Macquarie, a large infrastructure investment bank out of Australia, investing in various types of infrastructure, but most notably in the latter part of his tenure at Macquarie, dealing specifically as the head of North American renewable energy investing for Macquarie. We do have a strategy today that invests directly both in the construction of sustainable infrastructure projects, primarily wind and solar, although we've recently acquired a biomass plant in Colorado. We deploy capital primarily at two different stages in renewable energy infrastructure. The stage at the earliest point is when an asset is fully developed but needs to be constructed, and then where we'll take ownership at the completion of the construction. And the other is where we deploy capital into projects that are already in operation, whether that be a day or a number of years. And our primary goal is to be an asset owner, manage the assets because of their predictable stream of income and known cash flow. So maybe the next slide, and I'll hand it over to Charles to talk more about the asset class.
So thank you, Brandon.
This slide is just a very simple diagram of the life cycle, if you like, of renewable energy, from the generation from whether it be wind and solar infrastructure. It's distributed through the transmission system to utilities generally, and then those utilities have responsibility to dispatch that power into the market, generally to consumers, both industrial and individuals. So I think the important thing about electricity in the United States, the electricity market, is it's a totally regulated market. That means it has an enormous amount of oversight from the federal government and from state government. And so the whole process is very, very regulated. That means that the energy, the revenues that we generate are very predictable and safe. We generally have very long-dated contractual arrangements with the utilities. The utilities, because they are essential service providers, tend to be highly credit-worthy, and all of those elements mean that the investments are generally fairly low risk. I'm drawing out that risk point because a lot of potential investors, when they're considering investment in renewables, ask the question about risk and reward. And I think it's important to point out that our focus is on the low risk side, where we're buying assets that are very close to, if not already generating revenues. Those revenues are very predictable, very, very high credit quality because they come from utilities. And so, not surprisingly, the returns that are generated are on the lower end of the scale. The other end of the spectrum would be if we were to be investing in construction or in development, I should say, of these projects. There you don't use very much capital because a lot of effort goes into the siting and local municipal approvals and all of those sorts of things. So it's a lot of sweat equity, but not a lot of cash. The cash starts to get utilized when you build the project and when it starts operating. So we get much higher returns in the development phase, but we're not participating in that process. We tend to focus our energy on the operations side, where there's a lot more capital required, but the returns tend to be lower. Next slide.
Yeah, so this just will piggyback more off what Charles was talking about as far as the various stages that you can enter into a renewable energy project. Something that we're very interested in, and I think that most attendees on the call today are very interested in, is the amount of impact that these investments generate. And that can vary depending on the stage that you enter into a renewable energy power plant. The development phase, well, at one point in time, once the project is completed, will generate a fair amount of impact. It doesn't necessarily generate a lot of measurable impact when you're putting capital to work. Where Greenbacker typically enters into a project is when the project is fully developed but needs to be constructed or is in operation. What that tends to do is it generates a tremendous amount of construction jobs when the projects are being installed. And then once the projects are obviously in operation and are generating revenue, there's a very immediate and measurable impact by way of the reduction of carbon that's occurring due to the fact that they are renewable energy power plants. There are then more jobs that are created due to the ongoing operations and maintenance that is required of these assets. While they are not traditional power plants that have hundreds of employees on site that you might see at a natural gas or coal-fired power plant, there are still a few employees that are required to perform ongoing and regularly scheduled maintenance So I think that this chart does a good job at both depicting the risk and returns that can be expected at the various stages of investing in renewable energy power plants. But one thing that maybe isn't so clear on here that I think is worth pointing out is that typically at the construction phase and in the operations phase is where you can generate the most amount of impact. And of course, at the operations phase is the easiest to measure that impact by way of the amount of electricity that's being generated, which of course can be monitored in real time, which is a nice attribute when you're looking to reflect the amount of impact that you might be generating to a board or to a group of trustees or to an investment committee that's considering making an impact with the that's considering making an investment with impact as the primary goal. Hannah, the next slide, please.
So the next couple of slides are just examples, so you can better perhaps visualize what's involved in a transaction. Greenbacker acquired a portfolio of 2.5 megawatts of assets that were installed on the roof of the Denver Housing Authority, which is the local housing authority in the city of Denver. They had a 15-year contract to buy the electricity output, and the price of that electricity was subsidized, you might say. It was reduced price electricity for the benefit of the occupants of the Denver Housing Authority. And then the sort of returns that we generated from that investment are around 10.5%. So we bought this rooftop solar asset. It's generating cash flows. For 15 years, we've got very predictable cash flows. But as you can see, the returns that we generate from that investment are in the sort of attractive range, in the 10.5% cash yield. The next slide is another transaction that we recently acquired. This again was an operating asset. It's a 27.8 megawatt portfolio of solar assets in North Carolina. This one had been in operation for a little longer, so it only has 13 years left of contracted cash flows. But as you can see, again, generating a very attractive return and you know, a good credit off-taker for that particular portfolio. It does say Denver Housing Authority is the off-taker there. That is actually not the case. It's the Duke Energy, which is a large utility in North Carolina. So you can see that's the sort of investments that we're making, operating infrastructure assets, generating stable cash flows over long periods of time. The only variable in all of this is the amount of sunlight that we get from year to year, and the amount of activities that might occur from another weather perspective, such as you know, a hurricane coming through or other weather events that might take out the power grid. So very predictable over time sort of cash flows that are generated. One thing I think that's important, again, in the context of impact, is that when utilities and customers are looking at making decisions around acquiring electricity, the big factor is cost. What does it cost me to buy renewable energy vis-a-vis gas-fired generation or coal-fired generation? And I suppose it's from an investor's point of view, it's not great to see the returns are on the lower end of the spectrum, but from a point of view of being competitive with other energy sources, you know, that's a positive, because we are able to attract capital that is a lower cost of capital, and of course that means we're more competitive in the overall marketplace, meaning more renewable energy will be coming into existence going forward, and less of the alternative. So I think, generally speaking, I think that's a positive rather than a negative.
And Hannah, if you could maybe just skip ahead to slide 9, and this does it says 14, I think, on yours. One more. Here, this slide depicts, this is a study that Lazard puts out each year called the levelized cost of electricity or energy, which looks at the cost to produce a new kilowatt of electricity on an unsubsidized basis. And you can see in the yellow and green are solar and wind, which over the last number of years have become the cheapest form of new electricity generation, which is a significant driver of demand, which is creating a tremendous amount of opportunities to put capital to work in this space, in addition to the renewable portfolio standards that have been put in place by 29 different states, which will soon increase to more states that require the state to produce or purchase a certain amount of electricity from renewable sources by a date set in the future. As more states come on board that set those renewable portfolio standards, more opportunities will arise to put capital to work in those states. In addition to the renewable portfolio standards and the declining cost of renewables, of course, we have the issue of our aging infrastructure within the United States, specifically coal, which, when coupled with other forms of traditional electricity generation, close to 50% of that fleet across the country is more than 35 years old. And the effort to put Band-Aids on that infrastructure to keep it running is becoming increasingly more expensive. And therefore, that infrastructure is being retired or taken off the grid. When that occurs, given that the energy consumption and the demand for energy in the United States tends to continue to increase, that capacity must be replaced, and must be replaced in a somewhat quick and orderly fashion. And so all of these things coupled together are why Greenbacker certainly feels that there will continue to be a tremendous amount of opportunity to put capital to work at various stages of owning renewable energy infrastructure. We simply believe that doing it in kind of the lowest risk asset ownership, most known cash flowing aspect of the business is what not only makes the most impact, but generates the most predictable and risk adjusted returns. So Hannah, maybe we'll pause there and pass it back to you.
Great, thank you. And now that we have the big picture overview, wanted to just turn back to Dan to talk a little bit about what this has looked like in your portfolio and some of the other investments that you're working on, and then we will go to questions from there.
Great. Thanks for that overview. So just within our portfolio, as a Greenbacker team mentioned, we do have a fixed income investment with Greenbacker exactly for that purpose, to have a steady stream of reliable income, in particular because it's in our endowment portfolio where we have a board policy to generate at least a 5% return that we can then put towards programmatic work at the Sierra Club side. So as we are investing in funds for that particular portfolio, we are certainly looking at low risk, consistent return opportunities that align with climate solutions. And so the Greenbacker Fund really hits all of those criteria for that fund. But to his earlier slide that showed the kind of development and pre-development phase for many of these solar and wind projects, we had a number of conversations internally to think about what could we do to provide some sorely needed capital early in those types of projects. And I would just say that overall, the reason we've been increasingly thinking about how intentional we are with our investments is for a couple of macro reasons I think many of the folks on the webinar consider as well. One is, most of our funds come in from donors, and they're giving us money to advance the mission of the Sierra Club. And so we want to make sure that our investments are also aligned with that donor intent. Secondly, there have been a number of stories over the last couple of years about different foundations or nonprofits who are investing, for instance, in fossil fuel investments, yet put significant program dollars towards transitioning out of fossil fuels. So there's an increasing reputational risk associated with having investments that are not aligned with their mission, as another big consideration for our overall portfolio assessment. Third, over the last 10 years for our ESG aligned overall portfolio, we've actually gotten better net returns on that portfolio than blended benchmarks that we've held it up against. So we firmly believe, our performance going into the future, as long as it's aligned with our mission, will actually continue to result in better returns. And some of those graphs that you just saw from Greenbacker really underpin that assumption. And then finally, we really want to think about how can our investments in climate solutions also advance some social justice outcomes. We have a real commitment to equity, justice, and inclusion, and we want to make sure that in addition to the programmatic work that we fund, that we also align our investments and use those to leverage opportunities. So I just want to give you two short examples of where we're investing early in a solar and wind project on tribal lands, and talk about what we hope are some of the desired outcomes from that effort. So this slide, last month, or actually in late April, the Navajo Nation, which is the largest American Indian nation in the lower 48, passed a historic resolution to move from fossil fuels to 100% clean energy across the reservation. This is significant because 4 of the largest coal plants in the nation either reside on the reservation or very close by the reservation. And one of them, the Navajo Generating Station, is basically on the schedule to be decommissioned and retired. So there are some lost jobs associated with that plant closing down, but the Navajo also see it as a tremendous opportunity to chart a new future and move away from fossil fuel colonization towards self-determination and sovereignty to be in charge of their own energy needs. Currently, about 40% of the Navajo population doesn't have any electricity at all, in part because many of those houses are far-flung and not connected to a grid. So in addition to providing utility-scale solar project, they're also really interested in providing microgrids and individual solar capacity for many of these far-flung communities to enhance the justice across their people. So about a year or two ago, a B corporation called Navajo Power was established, co-founded by some energy innovators here in the Bay Area, along with some Navajo leaders. And their vision is to create up to 1 gigawatt of capacity of new solar on the reservation, which translates to about 10,000 acres worth of solar panels. And so they are very early in the pre-development piece of that, which means getting the siting analysis done, getting in the queue for some of the permission for the transmission line capacity, beginning to identify potential power purchasers, and just do that kind of due diligence and get it ready for attracting a solar developer to actually come in and build out the panels. So in this very early phase, they are looking for early capital to help them do this kind of work. Approximately $8 million they'll need in the pre-development phase. So we decided that we would invest initially by providing a very low interest unsecured loan of $500,000, along with a few other foundations, and pool that together, and they've been able to use those dollars to get going on this pre-development piece, also do some local community engagement and get a number of chapters on the reservation to do some land withdrawals. So next slide, please. So why solar? Well, this picture pretty much says it all. And you'll see where that circle is. That's approximately where the Navajo Reservation is. It's really right in the middle of one of the greatest, most consistent solar areas in the nation. So for them, they really have a sunny future. And this is the key to energy independence for the reservation. Next slide. So as I said, currently, what needs to happen is those 10,000 acres minimum that they need for panels need to be withdrawn and repurposed for solar generation. And Navajo Power is very committed to working at the community level and have been working with a number of the independent chapters on the reservation to get tribal resolutions that redesignate lands for solar. And in particular, those chapters are best equipped to figure out, okay, where are the lands that we could put solar on that wouldn't prohibit traditional land uses or would reclaim lands that are currently unproductive. So the picture on the left shows a solar project that's getting up and going that is on an abandoned coal mine site. The one on the right is a number of sheep grazing allotments are being considered for the solar panels, where the sheep can continue to graze, actually keep the grass down, cut short around the solar panels. And then the solar panels would eventually generate revenue that would augment the existing revenue for those grazing allottees. So those are two examples. And before I move to the Standing Rock Sioux, I'd say in particular what really attracted us to this was, one, the utility scale level of their vision for solar power. Two, that a lot of the potential power purchasers are cities like Los Angeles or San Diego, Phoenix, the state of Nevada. Many of those cities have made 100% clean energy commitment through the Sierra Club's Ready for 100 campaign and are actively looking for ways to move off of coal and onto wind and solar. So we think the power purchaser lay of the land is very attractive right now for this energy that will be generated. The way we kind of de-risk that $500,000 loan, half of that we asked Navajo Power to put it directly towards the application cost for the transmission line authorization, since that application cost means they have to put down a $250,000 deposit. And the earlier they get in that queue for that transmission line power, the more likely they'll be able to secure that transmission line capacity for any solar power that's generated on the reservation. Okay, so next slide. I'm going to shift over to the Standing Rock Sioux. As many of you know, the Standing Rock Sioux have had a very challenging couple of years fighting the Dakota Access Pipeline, which would basically cut right across some ancient burial sites and across some key waterways. And in addition to that fight, though, they've always had this long-term vision about creating a public power utility for the tribe based on wind power. So they've been approached by different wind developers over the years to lease out land for wind development, but they've held fast and said, no, we actually want to own that wind power and we actually want to create a power utility. Next slide. So just as that Navajo Reservation was in the center of solar capacity, you'll see the circle here of where the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation is between North and South Dakota. It is really the area where you have the greatest and most consistent wind for wind power, and also a number of transmission lines come very close to the reservation that would feed major cities in the Midwest. So there is power purchaser opportunities as well. Next slide. So as I said, they want to create a new public power utility that would be owned by the tribe for the tribe, but then also generate energy that would be exported off of the reservation. And in their mind, that would also reverse this long history of energy colonization, where energy, be it fossil fuel or even clean energy, is generated on the reservation, but they don't accrue the benefits from it. For example, right now there's a small solar project on the reservation, not too far from where the protests were for Dakota Access Pipeline, where they are contracted to sell that solar power to the grid, to the national grid, for 2.5 cents a kilowatt hour. Yet the tribe has to buy back electricity from the national grid at 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So for me, that's a very clear example of the energy injustice that the tribe is currently facing, and why they really want to be able to have energy independence and maintain and strengthen the sovereignty they have as an independent nation. So we're really excited about that. We've provided them a recoverable grant of $250,000, along Wallace Global Fund and JPB Foundation have also put in dollars. And once again, they need the money, and they've been putting it towards pre-development siting analysis, permit research, transmission line considerations, power purchase conversations. And so it is really at a pre-development phase. So in both of these cases, our board decided for fiduciary responsibility. It did not hit the bar for a traditional investment. And we decided to pay for these out of this high impact investment carve out, which has a specific board policy that says the goal for that carve out is program outcome first, at least a preservation of capital, and a longer timeline for returns. For instance, the Standing Rock recoverable grant, once they get to the point where a developer would commit to building out the wind project, they would return that money to us and to these other foundations, and then we would turn around and invest it in an actual going project at that time. Right now, they're estimating a return of 15 to 20% in a fixed income cash yield on this project, based on a number of, I think, very credible due diligence research documents that they've done. So with that, I just thought those are two kind of exciting examples for us that I thought I'd share with folks, and turn it back to you, Hannah.
Great. Thank you for both of those presentations. And we have a perfect amount of time for questions. A lot have come in, but please continue to share questions in the chat and question boxes. And actually, one of the questions that came in advance was about how other IEN members are participating in green energy, solar, et cetera, kinds of projects, other renewable infrastructure projects. So if others on the line have experiences in this area that you want to share, please do add those as well, and I can bring them into the conversation. So to kick off the questions, they sort of fell in a few different areas, but there were a lot of questions around measuring impact. So one was kind of from the endowment side. How are endowments framing conversations around social impact and investment returns, and what kinds of metrics or tools are being used to show what opportunities advance a just transition and which don't? And similarly, questions to Greenbacker: how do you ensure that the energy transition is just? How do you measure and report to clients on those social and environmental impacts? So maybe if we can start there with each of you reflecting on measuring impact.
Well, I can just start on the social justice piece. For us, I guess one, that's what attracted us to some of these very specific projects where we could really get in deep and understand. For instance, Navajo Power as a B corporation, that its governance is still majority owned, if you will, by actual Navajo folks. That it's not a non-tribal owned entity that is then coming in and negotiating with the tribe, but is not actually owned by the tribe. So I'd say there's certainly that governance aspect. And then secondly, who do the benefits accrue to? And Navajo Power made a commitment early on that the benefits, as I said, either accrue to existing lessees for some of that income generation, but also that investments, once the solar project is approved and moving forward, would initially be offered to Navajo tribal investors before they would go out to more institutional investors as well. So I'd say in that whole case, we felt like there was a lot of leadership that was embedded in the Navajo power model, and that also is very consistent with sovereignty. And then the last piece I'd say is just seeing that the Navajo Tribal Council and then each of these chapters are at a governmental level for the tribes invested in passing actual resolutions in support of this effort. Gave us a lot of confidence that this is something the tribe is very invested in and would have staying power beyond any kind of political cycles of tribal elections and that kind of thing.
Great.
I think that was great, Dan. And I think what I think what you can see here is that it's very obvious that there's impact that's being created by both the Sierra Club and what Greenbacker is doing, and quantifying it and measuring it is another aspect of our business that we put a lot of focus on. Greenbacker produces a semi-annual impact report where we break down the total amount of electricity that's been generated, and there are a number of calculations on the government's website and others that you can apply that electricity generation into to come up with certain metrics. For instance, 1 year of energy production from Greenbacker reduces close to 1,400, or is the equivalent of 1,400 flights between New York City and London, 290 days on a cruise ship, 40,000 people not buying gas for a year, and 121,000 acres of rainforest absorbing for 1 year. In addition to the impact report, we use a system called IPAR via a partnership with one of our investors who created the IPAR system, which its goal is to create a, harmony amongst asset managers to come to one centralized location where you can actually view metrics that these asset managers are putting into IPAR. There are heat maps that dictate where a specific strategy is focused, whether it's climate, whether it's people, et cetera. It's a really, really great resource that we enjoy contributing to, but also to just see the growth of how a system like that is allowing asset managers from all over the country to come to one place and centralize their impact and how it's being measured.
Yeah, and so a lot of answers to one question. I just wanted to make the observation that renewable energy is, generally speaking, distributed. We've sort of seen the several photographs. You'll notice they're in rural America. They're outside the main metropolitan areas. They're creating jobs in those rural areas. Another important impact that we have is in the rural areas, we're contributing to the property tax coffers of the local towns. And of course, those coffers help pay for the education, helping to, I suppose, provide a better potential quality of education in rural America. So I think we have an impact on the very obvious level by virtue of the carbon footprint that we're diminishing, but there's also a lot of impact happening in other dimensions through job creation and better education and new technologies that people have access to, etc.
That's great. And we can come back to the questions around job creation and other community impacts, because there were a lot of questions around digging deeper into that. But first, maybe if we can just touch on, there's a question around the criteria that the Sierra Club Foundation uses when investing in renewable energy projects, and how that differs between market rate projects versus high impact projects that might not have the returns that you're looking for from a fiduciary responsibility lens. And there were kind of related questions, I think, that came in advance around, how do you maybe for each of those kinds of projects, think about due diligence questions, think about looking for funds or for projects that are, really achieving your goals and not just greenwashing, not just, looking good on paper. So if you can talk a little bit about how you think through those decisions, I think there are a couple different pieces to that.
Sure, and I'm happy after this webinar to share our high impact investment policy, which lays out the purpose and criteria that we think about these high impact investments. So I'd say the difference between our mission aligned investments and then what I've just talked about were these two high impact investments is the addition of some social justice outcomes, number one. Number two, looking at things that will naturally have greater risk because they're much earlier in the, they're much more upstream in the project development for that particular project. And oftentimes, there are not investors ready to put money into it because it really isn't investment ready, but they need that early capital to get going. And so I'd say the third piece of that is we generally, we're thinking of those in these $500,000 tranches versus multi-million because the risk is higher, but we also think the initial amount of money, a smaller amount, is just much more valuable in that early phase than much later. And then the other thing we bring to the table is the brand of the Sierra Club. And so for both of these projects, as well as another high impact investment we did with the Prime Impact Fund, our brand has helped them attract other early investors as well, because it's a well-known national brand, and seeing that other investors feel like, well, they've done due diligence around things like greenwashing and around things like social justice. So that's the other thing I'd say. But yeah, then as far as the due diligence, we had a number of conversations with fellow funders, with policymakers, both within the tribe, but also within the state, our local chapter around any kind of grassroots engagement or tensions or concerns, and then energy consultants as well, to give us a sense of are there what's the lay of the land for future power purchasing agreements, and is there a market for this energy, and those kinds of things as well. And then our process is we put that together into a staff recommendation with a due diligence memo that then goes to either our investment committee or our grants committee. In the case of a recoverable grant, it goes to our grants committee. In the case of, let's say, a low interest loan or a more traditional equity investment or impact investment, that would go through our investment committee, and then we get full board approval.
Great, thanks. And yeah, those resources we can post along with, if there are links, we can post along with the recording for folks to take a look at afterwards. So we have time.
Can I say one more thing about risk, which is that we did have our outside counsel evaluate, as we were thinking about carving out this high impact investment fund, we asked them specifically, how can we do that and ensure that we're not counter to our fiduciary responsibility as a board? And the feedback we got back from our outside counsel was, well, looking at approximately what you're thinking about is initially 5% of your overall portfolio, putting it towards something that's very mission aligned, but maybe higher risk, and you may end up losing some of that money, does not at all run counter to your fiduciary responsibility, because you are still advancing the mission, and it's an amount that's fairly de minimis compared to the overall size of your portfolio.
Great. I think that's helpful for people to think through. There were a couple of questions about what are some barriers to this kind of investing, and I think those kinds of questions are some of the barriers. So we have about 10 minutes left, so I have a few more questions to get through, maybe one more specific one, and then we can come back up to the high level. So one question around the returns that both of you were referring to, and one of our listeners was saying those are, excellent returns if you're talking about 10 or 15% fixed income returns. Is that something that an endowment should really be counting against their investment policy statement as fixed income, or is it acting more like equity? How should they be thinking about that in these kinds of investments?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So why don't we have a go at answering that question?
Great. Thank you.
So first of all, there are elements of fixed interest associated with investing in renewable infrastructure, and there are also elements of private equity. And I think we just heard that putting money to work in the early phases of development of projects is a bit of a risky exercise where you could lose your capital. And that's because, for example, you don't get the necessary permit, or they discover it's not viable to transmit the electricity down the electricity system or whatever, and suddenly you've spent money putting together plans and designs and so forth for a project that can't get built. So it becomes worthless. And so that would be an area where you'd be looking for equity style returns. When you come down to the sort of sector of the market in which we invest, there are potential for more highly risky assets in infrastructure assets, and there are lower risk ones. And where we have invested is in solar and wind, because one, the cost of the commodity that you utilize in order to generate the electricity is zero. There's no cost for sun, there's no cost for wind. If we were to go for a different product, like ethanol, for example, then we'd have to start thinking about the cost of the grains that we have to buy for that purpose. And for example, if there was a world shortage of particular grain, maybe the price would go up and the viability of that project would change. So you've got to look at the underlying risk profiles of the individual asset classes within the broader spectrum of renewable energy before you can determine whether it's more of a fixed interest or more of a private equity style investment. And the returns that we generate, we say are a very good proxy for fixed interest, because they're long dated. The only volatility you have is the weather risk. If you have good diversity of geography over which your assets are located, you're sort of minimizing the amount of location risk that you have with a specific asset. And so you're dumbing down the whole thing so that it becomes more like a bond. And then when you look at that, you say, well, I've got Duke Energy as my off-taker for 20 years. What would I get? What would the market be paying if it was a Duke bond being sold in the market, and comparing that return to the sort of returns that we can generate selling electricity to Duke Energy for a very long period of time as well. So that's how we form a view about where the return should be on the spectrum, from more equity style returns to more fixed interest style returns. And we think that actually the returns that are generated from renewable energy infrastructure in the wind and solar and biomass space are very, very attractive vis-a-vis the bond market.
Perfect.
Yeah, and if I could add, just from an asset owner, that fixed income amount that once it's been constructed and is generating that consistent amount, to us is a hedge against the ups and downs of some of the other equities that we're invested in. And particularly, for, let's say, our gift annuity program, we're contracted to pay 6 or 7% sometimes to folks as a monthly income off of that portfolio. So we really need that kind of consistent return and predictability, over a 10 or 20 year amount of time at a minimum, which is different than, some of the other parts of our portfolio where we do have equities and can weather the ups and downs associated with that.
Perfect, and great to see both perspectives on and how that fits. So we're down to the last couple of minutes. So there were a number of questions that I think we've covered in one way or another about how you center communities and workers, how you look to examples from across this country and other countries. But I know this topic generated a lot of interest and a lot of questions. So my last question to each of you for just a final statement would be, how do we keep this conversation going within the network? What are your takeaways? What do you want to hear more from the network about? And how can attendees on this webinar take this conversation back to their colleagues? So if we can just close with that one.
Sure. Well, I'll just say that I appreciate this opportunity, and am the first to say this is adaptive management for us. We're learning as we go. We certainly don't have all the answers, and I would love to have folks on this network that have similar experiences, challenges, and knowledge to be able to have much more of a shared learning opportunity through through sharing documents, through offline conversations. Would really look forward to that, and I'm happy to share some stuff. So I don't know, Hannah, if there's a shared resource place that we could put some of this, but I'm happy to contribute what we can.
My comment is really around, we're out talking to endowments all the time. You've heard that the Sierra Club, for example, is an investor in us. One roadblock we encounter frequently is that the endowments have consultants that advise the endowment as to how to allocate their assets and what they make in terms of investment. And so I encourage everyone on the call that is in that situation, if they are really genuinely interested in putting capital to work in this space, to really pressure their consultants to invest the time and understand what is going on in the landscape, so that when you decide you want to make an investment, the gatekeeper, so to speak, is already educated as to what's out there and what they can do to help facilitate that investment. When you make that outreach, though, I think it's also important that they work out which bucket we fit in, and they have a pretty good understanding of the risk profile, because another common feedback we get is that the people don't really know where we sit in the spectrum of risk and reward, and how they should analyze this. And if they put a project like a solar project into a general infrastructure bucket, for example, general infrastructure might have a return of 15%, and a renewable energy project might have a return of 8 or 7%, they're going to say the returns don't meet the criteria. And immediately, that's an easy way of just turning your back on this opportunity. You have to push through that and get the consultants to actually put a proper comparison of risk beside the returns that are being offered. And that's where this becomes more of a fixed interest type analysis and not a private equity analysis. But if you don't get the consultant thinking about it in the right way, you basically deny yourself the opportunity to put capital to work in what is obviously an impactful way.
Great, and I think we have a few consultants on the line who might take that back internally as well. So we are right on time, so we will end here, but as Dan mentioned, we can share materials on this webinars page. So when you get the recording, we can also share other resources there, can connect folks after the call. And then if you go to our events page, you can see some opportunities to keep this conversation going in person as well. So thank you all for joining, and keep an eye out for those resources coming tomorrow or so. And thank you again, Dan and Charles and Brandon, for a really informative conversation.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.